Richmond, Virginia, August 1855. In the suffocating heat of a Tuesday afternoon on the auction platform at Lumpkin's Alley, something occurred that would fracture the carefully maintained order of Virginia's most powerful families. A slave was brought to the block, a young man whose appearance so thoroughly violated every assumption about human bondage that bidding didn't just exceed expectations. It stopped entirely for 17 full minutes while grown men stood paralyzed, unable to form words, unable to process what they were witnessing. Clear's throat. The price that finally broke the silence would reach $11,000, more than the cost of the entire auction house, more than some plantations sold for. The buyer, a man named Harrison Whitmore, would be dead within 3 weeks. His widow would vanish before his body was cold. And the beautiful slave who caused this catastrophe would trigger a sequence of events so disturbing that Richmond's newspapers would later conspire to erase entire days from their archives, creating gaps in history that remain unexplained to this hour. What was it about this particular slave that drove rational men to madness? What secrets surrounded his arrival in Richmond that powerful institutions spent decades trying to bury? Before we dive deeper into what became known among those who remember as the Richmond Horror, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. What you're about to hear has been deliberately hidden from history textbooks, and we need your help making sure these buried truths finally see light. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We're building a community of people who refuse to let uncomfortable history stay buried. The truth begins not on the auction block, but 6 weeks earlier in the mountains of western Virginia, where something happened that no one could explain. The town of Lexington sits in the Shenandoah Valley, a place where old Virginia money goes to pretend the modern world doesn't exist. In July 1855, a traveling slave trader named Gideon Hale arrived there with a coff of 12 slaves he'd purchased from failing farms in Kentucky. Hale was known for his cruelty, even among men who made their living in human suffering. He worked alone, trusted no partners, and had a reputation for acquiring slaves through methods that other traders considered too dangerous or too immoral, even by their degraded standards. Hale checked into a boarding house on the edge of town, chained his slaves in the stable, and proceeded to drink himself into a stupor at the local tavern. This was his pattern: buy low in Kentucky, sell high in Richmond, drink away the guilt in between. But that night something changed. A woman appeared at the tavern. No one could later agree on her description. Some remembered her as elderly, others as middle-aged. Some said she wore black silk, others claimed simple homespun. But everyone remembered her eyes. Gray eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the corruption beneath. She sat down across from Gideon Hale and spoke to him for less than 5 minutes. No one heard what was said. But when she left, Hale sat motionless for nearly an hour, sweat pouring down his face despite the evening cool, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't lift his glass. He stumbled back to his boarding house after midnight. The next morning, the stable where he'd chained his coffle stood empty. All 12 slaves had vanished. Their chains lay on the ground, still locked. No sign of forced entry, no evidence of how they'd escaped. And Gideon Hale was found in his room, conscious but unresponsive, his eyes open, but seeing nothing, saliva running down his chin. The town doctor examined him and declared him the victim of some kind of apoplectic fit. His mind was gone. Whatever had happened to him had burned out his ability to speak, to reason, to function as anything more than a breathing body. He was taken to an asylum in Stanton, where he would spend the remaining 4 years of his life sitting in a chair, staring at nothing, occasionally whimpering like a beaten dog. The escaped slaves were never found. The mystery of how they'd freed themselves from locked chains in a secured stable remained unsolved, and most people in Lexington were content to forget the entire disturbing incident. Most people, but not everyone. 3 weeks after Hale's collapse, a slave appeared at the Richmond auction house of Pulliam and Slade. He arrived alone, walking through the front door at mid-morning, his wrists bound by simple rope, no chains, no handler, no documentation of ownership. James Pulliam, the senior partner, later described the moment of his arrival as the strangest experience of his 40-year career in the slave trade. The young man was perhaps 23 years old, tall and lean, with skin that held a color somewhere between honey and amber, suggesting mixed ancestry, though not in the usual patterns. His features possessed a symmetry that seemed mathematically impossible. High cheekbones that caught light like sculpture, a jawline that could have been rendered by a master portraitist, eyes of such an unusual color, a deep violet blue that appeared almost luminous in certain light, that PM actually stepped backward when the young man looked directly at him. But it wasn't just the physical beauty, though that alone was extraordinary enough to draw attention. It was something else, and quality of stillness about him, a sense that he existed somehow outside the normal flow of time and circumstance. He moved with a grace that suggested noble breeding. Yet his clothes were simple laborer's garments, worn but clean. He spoke when spoken to, his voice cultured and precise. Yet he offered no explanation for his presence. No story of where he'd come from or who owned him. "Who sent you here?" PM demanded, trying to reassert authority over this deeply unsettling situation. "I was told you would know what to do with me," the young man replied calmly. Told by whom? By the woman in gray. Pulliam felt ice travel down his spine. He'd heard rumors from Lexington. Travelers passing through Richmond had spoken of the strange incident with Gideon Hale and the vanished slaves. The woman no one could clearly describe. And now this beautiful creature stood in his auction house claiming she'd sent him. "What's your name?" Pulliam asked, his voice barely steady. "My name is Josiah. Do you have papers, documentation of ownership, a bill of sale?" Josiah smiled, and the expression carried such sadness that PM felt ashamed without understanding why. "No papers, no ownership, nothing but what you see before you, then you're a runaway. I should hand you over to the authorities." "You could do that, but you won't because you've already calculated my value, Mr. PM. You've already imagined the price I would bring at auction, and you've already decided that profit outweighs legality." The accuracy of this assessment struck PM like a physical blow. It was exactly what he'd been thinking. A slave of such extraordinary appearance, offered without documentation or traceable ownership, represented an opportunity unlike anything he'd encountered. If he simply entered Josiah into his next auction with manufactured paperwork, who would question it? Who would look past that face and body to ask uncomfortable questions about providence and legality? "Where would you even go if I released you?" PM asked, more to himself than to Josiah. "A slave without papers is as good as court. You'd be recaptured within a day. Then it seems we both understand the situation. You profit, I receive food and shelter, and we avoid involving authorities who might ask questions neither of us want to answer." And so Pulliam made his devil's bargain. He created false documentation claiming Josiah had been sold to him by a Kentucky farmer, forged a bill of sale with a practiced hand, and entered him into the upcoming auction scheduled for August 14. He told his business partner, Samuel Slade, only that he'd acquired an exceptional piece of property that would bring unprecedented prices. He told no one about the mysterious circumstances of Josiah's arrival, or the deeply unsettling conversation they'd shared. But word spread anyway. Word always spreads in Richmond when something extraordinary appears. Within days, whispers circulated through the city's elite circles. A slave of impossible beauty. A young man who looked like something from mythology rather than mundane reality. A once-in-a-lifetime acquisition for whoever had the means and the will to possess him. The Whitmore family heard these whispers at exactly the wrong moment in their declining fortunes. Harrison Whitmore had inherited his father's tobacco plantation 5 years earlier with grand ambitions of expansion and modernization. Instead, he presided over steady decline, poor crop yields, bad investments in railroad stock, mounting debts to Richmond banks. His wife, Catherine, came from old Virginia money, but her family's wealth was tied up in land and reputation rather than liquid capital. The Whitmores maintained appearances through increasingly desperate measures, hosting lavish parties they couldn't afford, purchasing luxuries on credit, always one step ahead of creditors. Harrison's younger brother, Thomas, watched this decline with growing alarm. Thomas had none of Harrison's grand ambitions or Catherine's social pretensions. He managed the plantation's daily operations while his brother played gentleman farmer in Richmond. He understood exactly how close they were to complete financial collapse. And he'd been arguing for months that they needed to sell assets, reduce expenses, admit their limitations before disaster became unavoidable. But Harrison wouldn't listen. Harrison believed in appearances, in the power of reputation to overcome material reality. And when he heard about the extraordinary slave being offered at Pulliam and Slade, he saw opportunity rather than risk. A slave of such remarkable appearance would be the ultimate status symbol. Proof that the Whitmore family still commanded resources, still deserved their place among Virginia's elite. The price didn't matter. The cost would be justified by the social advantage he would gain. Thomas tried to reason with him. They didn't have $11,000 to spend on a single slave. They barely had $11,000, period. But Harrison dismissed these concerns. He would find the money. He would borrow from the banks using the plantation as collateral. He would win the auction and restore the Whitmore name to prominence through sheer audacity. Catherine, for her part, had her own reasons for supporting the purchase. She'd heard different rumors about Josiah, whispers among the women of Richmond society about the slave's unusual qualities, how he seemed to understand things before they were spoken, how his presence in a room changed the atmosphere, made people confess truths they'd intended to keep hidden. Catherine had secrets of her own, secrets that threatened everything she'd built. And she believed with the magical thinking of desperate people that possessing this extraordinary slave might somehow protect her from exposure. The other major interest came from the Preston family. Senator Marcus Preston represented Virginia in Washington, a position of enormous power and influence. His son, Daniel, managed the family's Richmond holdings, including a townhouse on Grace Street, where the senator stayed during his frequent returns from the capital. Daniel had recently married a Philadelphia AYS named Elizabeth, bringing much-needed capital into the Preston family coffers, but the marriage was troubled. Elizabeth found Virginia society stifling and backward. She hated the slavery that surrounded her, made no secret of her abolitionist sympathies, and had already threatened to return to Philadelphia and take her fortune with her. Daniel, desperate to salvage his marriage and maintain access to Elizabeth's money, thought the beautiful slave might serve as a peace offering, something so rare and valuable that even Elizabeth's moral objections might be overcome by the aesthetic appeal. He imagined presenting Josiah as essentially a work of art rather than a laborer, a household ornament that would demonstrate the Preston family's refined taste rather than their participation in human bondage. It was twisted logic born of desperation, but Daniel believed it absolutely. As August 14 approached, James Pulliam realized he'd created something far more dangerous than a simple high-value auction. The interest in Josiah had taken on an obsessive quality. Multiple wealthy families had made private inquiries. Offers of advanced purchase at premium prices, thinly veiled threats about what might happen if they didn't win the bidding. The situation had escalated beyond normal commercial competition into something darker, something that felt like violence, waiting for an excuse to manifest. Pulliam tried to manage the situation by establishing strict auction rules. Each bidder would be required to show proof of funds before participating. Bidding would be conducted in a private room rather than the public block. Only serious buyers with verified resources would be admitted. But these precautions, intended to prevent chaos, would prove entirely inadequate for what was coming. The night before the auction, Josiah requested to speak with Pulliam privately. The auction house owner found him in the holding room sitting on a simple cot, his hands folded calmly in his lap. In the lamplight, his beauty seemed even more pronounced, almost painful to witness directly. "You know what's going to happen tomorrow," Josiah said quietly. "Not a question, a statement." "I know there will be substantial bidding," Pulliam replied carefully. "I expect to see a final price that will satisfy all parties." "That's not what I mean. You know there will be violence. You've felt it building. Men don't spend $11,000 on a slave without rage and desperation driving them. Whatever happens tomorrow will destroy someone, probably multiple people, and you'll bear responsibility for facilitating it." Pulliam felt anger rise in him. "I'm conducting legitimate business. If wealthy men want to compete for valuable property, that's their affair. I didn't create the circumstances that brought you here, didn't you?" Josiah's violet eyes fixed on him with unsettling intensity. You chose to proceed without questioning where I came from. You chose to forge documentation rather than investigate my origins. You chose profit over conscience, Mr. Pulliam, and tomorrow you'll see where that choice leads. What are you? Pulliam whispered, voicing the question that had haunted him for weeks. You're not like other slaves. You're not like anyone I've ever encountered. What really happened in Lexington with Gideon Hale? Who is the woman in gray? Josiah smiled, that sad smile again. Some questions answer themselves, Mr. Pulliam. Pay attention tomorrow. Watch what happens when men try to possess what was never meant to be owned. You'll understand everything then. The conversation left Pulliam deeply shaken. He returned to his office and spent hours reviewing the forged documentation he'd created, searching for some flaw that might provide excuse to cancel the auction. But the papers were perfect. He'd been too skilled at his forgery, and more practically canceling now would enrage the wealthy families who'd already committed to bidding. He was trapped by his own greed into seeing this through to whatever conclusion awaited. August 14th arrived with oppressive heat and air so thick it felt like breathing water. The auction was scheduled for 2 o'clock. By noon, the Whitmore, Preston, and 3 other wealthy families had assembled at Pulliam and Slade, each accompanied by lawyers and financial agents, each determined to win regardless of cost. Harrison Whitmore arrived with documents showing he'd mortgaged his entire plantation. Every acre, every building, every slave he currently owned, all offered as collateral for a loan that would give him the liquid capital to bid without limit. Thomas had refused to attend, making his disgust with this insanity clear, but Catherine accompanied her husband, dressed in her finest silk, ready to witness their family's salvation or destruction. Daniel Preston brought bank drafts worth $15,000, the maximum he'd been able to extract from Elizabeth's trust, without her direct authorization. She didn't know he was here. She didn't know he was about to spend her inheritance on a human being. He planned to present Josiah to her as an accomplished fact, believing she would accept it once confronted with the reality. The other bidders represented various degrees of wealth and desperation, a cotton factor named Williams, who saw Josiah as an investment that could be resold to northern collectors for even higher prices. A widow named Mrs. Ashford, whose interest seemed to go beyond commercial considerations into territory that made even the other bidders uncomfortable, and a quiet man named Graves, who offered no explanation for his presence, but whose eyes held a cold calculation that suggested purposes no one wanted to examine too closely. At exactly 2 o'clock, Josiah was brought into the private auction room, and for 17 full minutes, no one spoke, no one moved. They simply stared at him with expressions ranging from awe to hunger to something approaching fear. The reality of his presence exceeded every description they'd heard. He stood on the raised platform in simple clothing, his hands unbound now, his posture relaxed but dignified, and he looked at each bidder in turn with those violent eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the desperations and corruptions beneath. James Pulliam finally broke the silence, his voice strained. "Gentlemen, ladies, we'll begin bidding at $1,000. $5,000, Harrison Whitmore said immediately, his voice tight with need. $7,000, Daniel Preston counted without hesitation. $9,000, Mrs. Ashford said, her eyes never leaving Josiah's face. The bidding escalated with terrifying speed. $10,000, $11,000, $12,000. The amounts being thrown out exceeded rational assessment of value. This was no longer commerce. This was something else, something dark and consuming. $15,000, the quiet man named Graves said calmly. Final offer. The room went silent. $15,000 for a single slave. The amount was obscene. It exceeded the combined annual income of most Virginia families. For a brief moment, it seemed the auction would end with Graves as the winner. But Harrison Whitmore wasn't done. His face had gone red, sweat pouring down his temples, his hands shaking. He looked at Catherine, who nodded almost imperceptibly, giving permission for the family's complete destruction, and Harrison said in a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere beyond rational thought. $20,000. The shock in the room was absolute. James Pulliam actually gasped. Daniel Preston made a sound like he'd been struck. Even Josiah, who'd maintained perfect composure, showed the faintest flicker of what might have been pity. Going once, PM said mechanically. Going twice. Sold, Graves said quietly from the back of the room. But not to Mr. Whitmore. Sold to death and misery and consequences none of you are prepared to face. What are you talking about? Cole demanded. You're not the high bidder. I'm not bidding at all,